I tell you, I think that one of the common threads between all of that, and I would probably even say for law and political science, is storytelling, and the idea of part of doing advocacy work is telling a story, and a compelling story to make people connect to it and want to care, because in the same way that one thinks about traditional storytelling, like movies or books, is partly developing a connection and empathy with the characters around that connect in. And I think very much that is a part of doing advocacy work, is developing a connection with the people and caring about the people, because I think people are more committed to the work, to the advocacy work, both the person doing the work and the person trying to help, when they think of the situation, the problem is affecting a human being and not as statistics and a series and data. But when you care about a person, it makes you feel more connected to it. So I don't know that one needs to be a writer to do that, but I think that is a common thread. In the same way, if you were a lawyer or a solicitor, you have to tell a story with your case and create a story.
Moving on to a broader concept of academic freedom, have you ever witnessed firsthand any kind of violation or limitation of this fundamental right in conducting your research work and practicing your academic profession, as well as in your personal experience?
I haven't had the experience, directly in the U.S. in terms of having, somebody where I feel like I am under attack for it. However, one of the issues globally with academic freedom, and I think it is part of sometimes the goal of the authoritarians, is for people to self-censor, to not say things. And I find that I become more and more aware of that. Now, in the U.S., they're not jailing academics for what they say, but I am aware more and more of the problems that can happen, and that sometimes it's coming from the student body up, and sometimes from the administration down. And again, in the U.S., I've seen not people I know directly, but people I would think of as colleagues, being dismissed from their jobs for things that they're saying, for coming under a lot of pressure. And of course, sometimes it might be deserved, because they might be very inappropriate things that they're saying or doing. But sometimes for their viewpoints, and if nothing else, making a lot of trouble for themselves. So I'm more aware of it than ever before. I'm more aware of self-censorship of it, and particularly because in the U.S. it's so divided, and there are people essentially looking for problems and looking to catch people on things they say. But no, I haven't had an issue of where I felt like the military or something is going to, authorities are going to come after me.
So shifting to scholars at risk and getting to the point, how did you first learn about SAR? And what actually prompted you to take up a career in ethical political activism by joining SAR Network?
Well, it ties a little to your first question about the writing. I was always very aware of my freedom to write what I wanted to write, separate of the commercial, the commercial part of it or the business part of it, but that I did not need to worry again about my freedom based on what I wrote, and I also read a lot and love foreign literature translation. And I read much more of it than I read American literature. And so much of what I read are people who have been persecuted, for what they've written. I don't seek that out, but when I start to read about them, you realize that they've had to fight against a lot of odds, political odds, for their perspective. And I started with, because I also, with students I wanted them to understand that by them having their own freedom, they had a responsibility to protect other people's freedom. And so having, that it was part of a community, and that you have to stick up for the vulnerable members of your community. In this case, thinking about it professionally. So I started seeking out opportunities for students to get involved in helping to protect writers who were being jailed and persecuted. I worked initially with the group Penn American Center, which works mostly with writers and journalists, and started working with some students doing very similar type work on specific cases. And about that time, just by coincidence, I met Robert Quinn, who's the executive director of Scholars at Risk. And we got to talking, and he was very interested in the student work, because that was something they hadn't been doing much of and wanted to engage with. And I got very interested in working with them, particularly broadening it out so it wasn't just about writers, but about scholars, thinking of writers also as scholars, and all the people in the scholarly community, and feeling the responsibility of one in an academic field and with an education to promote that. So that's how I came to start working with Scholars at Risk, and then really developed this seminar program together to expand it, so it wasn't just my little group of students, but now sitting here in Trento, talking with you and Baldo and Norway and Canada and parts of Canada. So that's how it started to grow. Because you're so, I'm hesitant to cite the statistic, but I know it's about 10% or less of the world are educated. I mean, there's just a small number of people who are educated, and I think there is a responsibility with that, and not just a responsibility to yourself, to get educated, to just from your own life, but I think that there comes a responsibility to the world to have that privilege, if you will, to do something with them. So.
Okay, in this regard, what have been the most challenging aspects of being part of SAR, mm-hmm. and what about the most rewarding ones?
The most challenging, I think, the cases are challenging, the situations are challenging. They are often witnessing the worst kinds of things, some of the worst kinds of things that can happen to people unexpectedly, and what powerful people will do to other people to maintain their own power, and the inhumanity within that, and especially there's that abstract ideal that is hard to come to grips with, but also when you start to meet people that this has happened to, and I know as you've met people, I'm sure here that are, at-risk scholars that are here and hear the experience and have gone through it, it's very challenging to accept that the world works like that. It feels big. It sometimes feels too big for one person or a group of people to take on, and sometimes it gets to you, especially when really bad things are happening to people. And talking about the storytelling empathy, when you start to feel a connection to them, you start to feel like it's happened to somebody having this awful thing happen. So that's been a challenge. But the positive part, is one seeing people take part in being committed to being part of the change, and seeing particularly students, I think, seeing that making that a part of their life, not their life, and I know many students will go on to do other things, but seeing it embedded into their brain, their consciousness a little bit, of being some caretakers for the world and having some responsibility, even if it's not going to be in academic freedom. You know, maybe it's going to be in environmental work or something else, but seeing that continue and seeing the generational work, and it's very moving. It's very moving to see students get very committed to it, and it's also been very, very moving when I've met some of the scholars who have been through these situations, and to see what to hear them, to hug them, to talk to them is quite moving as well, and family members.
So if I asked you what your definition of advocacy would be, what would you say? And what contribution, in your opinion, can advocacy make to the protection of academic freedom?
I mean, advocacy, of course, is a big, it can mean a lot of different things, and it can mean a lot of different things to different people of how to approach it, whether it's political advocacy or grassroots advocacy. But I think at its most basic level, to me, it is amplifying voices and having voices be heard, because the sort of, or the metaphor of shining light into the darkness, and keeping the light shining on situations, on people, and that. Again, that can be through political work, it can be through grassroots work, it can be through artwork, it can be through public demonstrations, it can be, one has to choose what they think is the best way to do that, both for the work that needs to be done, what might be most effective for the work that needs to be done, but also what is most effective for the people doing the work. It's very different if to think about how to handle it in Trento versus if you were in Rome, how you might do that. And to think about what one's own sense of power is as well. And sometimes people feel very powerless until you realize you do have some power. And you have voices. You have your consumers. You have all kinds of different kinds of power, social media power, and networks, and social networks, and so on. What was the second part of the question?
What contribution can advocacy make to the protection of academic freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the contribution it makes is by keeping it alive, and keeping the stories alive, and telling the stories, and not letting it fall back or recede into something that is either people just take for granted, and until they can't, but also keeping it in discussion and keeping it being a part of people's lives. So I think when you advocate for the people who don't have the freedom, it also reminds you again of the freedoms you have in protecting the freedoms, and the responsibility to protect the freedoms, not that they should have, but that you might lose too. And I mean, I can tell you without getting too political, but having been in the United States, particularly during the last presidential administration, there was many people, and even still to some degree now, with the leftovers from that, many people in the United States have started to understand how vulnerable they were in ways that they never thought they would be. When people trying to pass laws that we would think of as being in violation of what we would think would be academic freedom, of what you can't talk about in the classroom, what you can't teach in the classroom, what can't be discussed in classrooms, from gender theories to racial theories, and people realize how quickly it can go. And I think when you talk to, if you talk to, when you meet them in your classes or elsewhere, scholars, say from Turkey or even from Syria, will tell you how fast it went. That these educational systems and ways of being that they thought were just how we are, we're suddenly gone. So I think it needs caretaking and protecting, and it needs its own level of advocacy. But I think also by doing advocacy, it is a reminder of the care that needs to be taken.
Okay, could you point out for us what strengths and limits in advocating for threatened scholar students?
Well, again, I think the strengths are the collective voices, and again, keeping discussions going, because, and we talked about this yesterday in the class, that the premise is that people won't talk about them, that people forget about them, that people, and so I think it is a tremendous strength, which is why everybody's voice really can make a difference. Sometimes it feels like one of the limits might be, it feels like my own voice doesn't make a difference, but the strength is our collective voices do make a difference. And some of the limits, I think, are where these kind of meet the strengths and the limitations also are trying to figure out also what it is that you want to do and think you can do. And figure out what needs to be done, what are priorities. So sometimes just basic giving somebody medicine is the first priority before worrying about whether their trial is being conducted in the right way, or whether they should be released, or sometimes it's finding out where somebody is. Sometimes we don't even know where the scholars are being held. Their families just know they've been detained and they don't know where they are. So I think the strength of figuring out what you need, it's a limitation when you're not sure what it is that you need, and finding. I think it's limiting when you try to go it alone all the time, and can be a tremendous strength when you're unified not only with other people, just say in your community, but other organizations. I mean, for all these scholars have lots of people that are interested in them, from their own friends, their own communities. For Bayani, for example, has whole groups of her fellow graduate students from when she was in Canada that have their own groups, and Patrick Zaki, where working on their behalf, and Amnesty International, and the more people collectively come together, the more powerful it is, and it can be a little limiting, I think, when people fraction and go into their own factions, or fraction off rather than go into their own factions and don't work together.
If we wanted to be down to earth, how realistic is to say that SAR advocacy campaigns turn out to be successful in the majority of the cases? And what's, in your opinion, the degree of failure of these campaigns? And last question, how optimistic do you feel about SAR's future prospects in having a bigger and bigger impact in the world?
So the first part of the question is about successes and failures. So there are so many factors that go into something being successful, and we would think of success maybe being somebody being released. I mean, that would be sort of the ultimate success, and there are so many factors that go into that. And partly is there's all the pressure that might be being placed on the authorities that are holding somebody. There might be world events that are conspiring. Sometimes something happens in the world that puts a lot of world attention on cases that weren't there and puts a lot of pressure. Sometimes there are the things going on that we basically don't know about, that are going on behind closed doors between governments and different deals that are being made, that government A maybe wants some kind of military support, and the people with the military support say, well, they need to release the political prisoners. And so there's all these, but none of that still happens without all the pressure coming from groups. So, I think that I would be hard-pressed to say that probably with any of the successful cases, it has been because of one thing. It's not it's rarely been because of one thing. It's being part of something larger and part of this concerted effort. But I think it's also, I think we have to accept that it's long-term, and that not seeing, and so even if we pick something small, healthcare, or family visits, even if we don't see that happen in the first 3 or 4 months, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's a slow chipping away at it. And I would say from the SAR perspective, because we're involved in it all the time, so even when, say, a student group, the term ends and their work wraps up and they've done their advocacy work, that work is still going on. There are some cases where we eventually see the small steps. I think about it like archaeology, at least how I understand archaeology. When I see it in documentaries, where they're on these sites and they're with their little toothbrushes and they're cordoning off things, and they find one little thing, and that's a huge success to them. When we're doing the right thing, we found a part of a cup, from ancient Rome. So there must have been something here, and I think it's like that. I think that we see in the long term the little successes as the little things that we get, whether it is just hearing that someone's being treated better in jail, getting word from their family member that that things are better, word from the lawyer. So it's a slow process, and I think that is also something one has to accept, or it feels like failure. That it's probably going to be a long process. I can only think of a few cases where it's really felt like there's not hope, and it's often because from whatever the situation with the government, a government has just refused to budge. They often aren't even following their own laws. They're that committed to the situation. The case that Esther was talking about yesterday with the Uyghur scholar in China. He was sentenced to life in prison. He's the only political prisoner ever sentenced or at least the first political prisoner ever sentenced to life in prison. Usually it's a 5-year sentence, a 10-year sentence. They didn't really even follow their own legal procedures, and they just won't hear it. They won't hear it from other governments. They won't hear it. It's not just about advocates. They won't respond to, I think the EU was planning a trip to China, and they said, we'll only come if we can visit Elantari, and the Chinese government said, you can't even visit him. They called off the trip. So, there's some cases they're just bigger than what we can do. But that doesn't mean that we still can't keep saying, we know he's there, we know you're doing this, we know this is happening, either again for the sake of his family, perhaps for the sake of him in the prison, and somewhat optimistically for the sake of the next people coming.
Okay, so so we kept the most complex question for at the end, so we hope you don't mind. So academic freedom is often debated in relation to authoritarian regimes, while very little has been investigated in regard to the state of academic freedom in democratic context. So we would like to know if you personally feel like being American is a fortune for you, considering that the fact that America is a democratic country. And in this respect, do you believe that even for a full democratic country as the US, these freedoms are not a guarantee and could be lacking any time? And does every country in the world run the same degree of risk, no matter its political regime?
You know, as I said earlier, I don't think, say, in the U.S., you know, that we worry about being put in jail for it. But I do think it is fragile, and I think that people with authority, in order to maintain authority, will try to silence dissent, and they often look to the institutions of higher education, you know, because that is where people think critically, where they ask questions, where they question things, where they ask for evidence, where they don't just accept the party line of things. Because that is, I think no matter what the discipline is that you study, they all follow a similar model, that you have some kind of hypothesis and you test it with evidence, and you see if the evidence supports what you think, and that can be really dangerous to people who don't want people to think. So, and so I think that is always at risk. I think perhaps, at least for now, in the United States, it is perhaps a little more subtle. So, you know, for example, during the Trump administration, there was a lot of silencing of climate scientists. And so there were ways of, you know, perhaps not funding them, not allowing them to continue their research, which I think is, you know, is a form of this. Not letting them go to conferences to talk about their work, not letting them continue their research. So I think that there are those levels. There have also been, you know, I think some violations in the U.S. that would seem familiar to people from other countries, of, say, people who are on boards of trustees, who have very strong political viewpoints, who don't want the faculty at the university to have that, have denied tenure to people, further denied people getting hired because of that, which is, you know, it's sort of a quiet version of that. But I think it's vulnerable. I mean, you know, one of the you know, movements, so to speak, happening in the U.S. Has been, particularly by the far right in the U.S., has been to diminish college education, because, as you know, different from most of Europe, it's really, you know, it's expensive in the U.S. And so they start saying, well, it's a waste of money. They say it's a bunch of liberal people all trying to indoctrinate, you know, young, vulnerable people. You know, is this really a good thing to do? Which, and it's clearly, I shouldn't say clearly, you know, it seems as though there is some calculation to not having educated people, because they aren't asking the questions. And I should add, all the people saying this are all very well-educated people. You know, they've all been to Harvard, they all went to Yale and Princeton and these places. So I think it is more subtle in say, the U.S. So while I don't, again, well, as I said earlier, I find myself more aware of what I might say, and how that might create problems, which sometimes I accept and sometimes I just don't. Who needs them? But I don't think we're at that point yet that we are. But again, seeing what felt like a certain type of authoritarian tendency recently in the U.S., or at least an admiration for authoritarianism. I think many people realized how quickly it could change. But partly because how many people, not just the leaders, but how much of the citizenry believed this too.